Welcome to the Ideal Investor Show. This is the podcast where we help you challenge your mindset and discover where you are. Tired of stories about other people's success? We can help you change your life, determine your time freedom point, and join us on the journey to financial success. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the Ideal Investor Show, where we bring you interesting guests that fit well into our concept of passive income, retirement, time freedom point, all those kind of things. And we have a great guest today. Before we dive into this retirement stuff and 401ks and all those kind of good things, tell us a little bit what you're doing, but more interestingly, maybe first, how did you get to where you are now?
Sure. I've been practicing law since the mid-1980s. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I decided it was time to start slowing down a little bit, get off the billable hour treadmill and switch to an of counsel role. So I still was able to do the fun parts, but didn't have to worry about how many hours I was billing quite as much as I used to. And that was part of a step on getting towards retirement. I was looking forward to that after 35 plus years of law to try something new. And so as I started slowing down the law part, I wasn't able to slow down life entirely. I still had that activity buzz in my brain to do things. And it was always in the back of my head to write a book as well about something. But when I really started working on my personal retirement financial planning, that's when I got the idea for this book, because I just realized income taxes are kind of an ignored issue in a lot of retirement planning. As a lawyer, I was always trained to look for what's not there.
Right.
And as I was looking at retirement things, what was not there is income tax planning. And even though that could be, as I ran the numbers, a top 3 expense for me and probably a lot of other people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a reason they call it discovery, right?
Exactly.
To position this a little bit, did you have your own practice, basically the owner of a practice, or were you basically a partner of a larger practice, or how did that actually fit together?
Right. I was a senior partner at a firm that specializes in intellectual property. I've got an engineering background, an electrical engineering degree, and a law degree, and most of us at the firm have that technical and legal combination. So I mostly did litigation involving software, electronics, internet technologies, and things like that were suited to my background for over 30 years. And I've been a partner, for over 30 years at that firm. So very short resume. And that's where I started working when I was a law clerk in law school, and I never left.
Yeah, no,
until,
that's good.
Until a couple of days ago.
Yeah, the reason I was asking the question is also a little bit, you mentioned billable hours. And I mean, that's basically in my consulting business that I'm still practicing is basically the same thing, billable hours. But from a taxation perspective, because that's also part of what you're specializing in, there were years where it just made sense for me to be employed basically in my own company and do, basically trying to take advantage of some of the government programs. So that's why I was asking, right? Because right now here at Ideal Wealth Grower, I'm the owner and we don't really have billable hours or anything like that. But I'm also not employing myself. So I'm not really contributing to any kind of 401k or any kind of other solo fund one or those kind of things, which I did and have done in the other one. So for you, did you do anything like that, or was it basically straight out ownership and having to do everything on your own?
Right. I mean, I was an owner at the law firm. So in that sense, I was an owner or a part owner of a business. But from a tax standpoint or a retirement standpoint, it was pretty much like anybody else that gets a paycheck. I'd have my money withdrawn from my paycheck to go into a 401k, maybe get a little bit of a match, put a little extra money in some other places along the way, and have the W-2 just like most people. So folks don't have that. And there are certainly some tax deferred options, I think, even if you're self-employed, though, to put some money aside for retirement.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's what I meant. There's a vehicle called the Solo 401k, which is basically for LLCs that are either single owner or, like in my case, my wife and I, fellow owners basically, but that's still considered a solo ownership LLC, and that allows for like what's called a Solo 401k. It's an interesting thing because it allows basically to be treated as if you work for a company, but can do self-brokerage, so to speak. right? Because in many cases, it's interesting if you as an expert dive into that a little bit while we then transition on what do you do at the end when you have accumulated stuff in the
Right.
401k. But one of the things that I always thought was concerning, and I still think to this day it's concerning, that people are being basically told what their company's affiliation is with either Vanguard or Fidelity or whatever the big companies are. And that means you can choose low, medium, high risk. And then basically your money is taken out of your paycheck and you're just getting your annual thing and hope that it was a good year, right? And to me, that was just not really the thing. So even though we did the solo 401k for a little while, that at least allowed me to determine where is the money going to go. Right now, on the other hand, on the flip side, that also means you have full responsibility. But I know so many friends who work as employees have 401ks for a long time. And even though they didn't do the reinvestments, it still doesn't help them when the market goes down big time, like in 22. Well, then they could blame the Fidelities of the world, but it makes no difference.
Right. I mean, all your 401ks, typically the responsibility of the employer is to give you a bunch of choices
Yeah.
and give you some resources maybe, but basically you're on your own. And even if they have a default mode, that doesn't mean you should be using that default mode. I think just a little bit of time spent thinking about where that money's really going every year and what your situation is really going to pay off. That's one thing I think you get to this stage of life. I'm in my early 60s and you see that effect of that compounding.
Oh, totally.
Over the 30 years, right? It's a little bit for 5 or 10, 15, 20, and then it really gets noticeable. And then those little percentage differences, the difference between 6% or 8% or 8 and 10, I mean, it can add up to a lot of money when you add that up over 35 years. So that little bit of work, a little bit of tweaking the knobs every year for your career can really pay off big when you get to the end of the road.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. And one of the things that's a little sad, and I mean, as Idea Wealth Growers and as mentor for our clients, I'm always trying to encourage them to work with me and learn from me about what are all the options that you can do with your money. Even though I admit, we are somewhat biased towards real estate, but fundamentally to say, I don't want to just be pigeonholed in mutual funds because that's what every company for convenience and ease of use is doing, I think is exactly like you said, very important. Now, as you mentioned, these amounts, especially if you have the opportunity to do it for a long time, can become quite substantial. Part of your book, if I understand it correctly, talks about why you shouldn't wait for the rest of your life to slowly pull money out of your 401k. So can we start talking a little bit about what you discovered and how that can be applied?
Sure. So I figured out, as I mentioned before, income taxes is a big item you have to consider in your budget in retirement. Just because you're retired doesn't mean you're not going to owe taxes when it comes to pension, Social Security, tax deferred withdrawals from IRAs, 401ks. That's all taxable. So you got to worry about it. It's significant. But what I also saw was the conventional wisdom out there that you were just referring to, which says generally for your tax deferred accounts, wait as long as you can to take money out of there until you're required to at the time of these required minimum distributions, which these days are typically when you're about 72 to 74 years old. Those are the years where you have to start withdrawing unless you want to pay a penalty. And then at that point, if you can get by with just taking that required minimum amount, just take out the minimum. And there was some facial logic to that because, it grows tax deferred, and generally that's a good thing. But as I ran the numbers, I put together a calculator. I got some help from one of my kids who was a software engineer from Cornell to put together a little spreadsheet for me. And I realized that's generally true if you're going to park the money maybe for 30 years to leave it in tax deferred. But as you get closer to retirement, deferred benefit isn't as big a deal anymore, number one, because it's just fewer years. Number two, because your capital gains in your tax deferred accounts are treated as regular income, which is typically taxed at a much higher rate. The drawback of leaving it in those 401ks and IRAs, if there is capital gains there. And three, your tax rate is probably going to go up when you get to that point of required minimum distributions if you wait to withdraw. When you add the tax rate with that and Social Security and everything else, you could actually be paying more in taxes by waiting to withdraw, a lot more. And so that's really the premise of my book, From Savvy Saver to Smart, or From Savvy Saver to Smart Spender, is don't wait to withdraw all that money. I mean, certainly leave some in there, but if you can take advantage of some low tax years after you've retired or at least retired from full-time work and before Social Security and required minimum distributions kick in to bump your tax rate up again. It's kind of a bottom of a U curve, if you will, kind of a honeymoon phase between the end of work and the beginning of required minimum distributions, where you might be in a really nice low tax rate, which feels good, but it's also an opportunity that could be lost if you don't try to use up those lower tax brackets while you can by taking those withdrawals earlier from your 401k and IRA tax deferred accounts.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Now, if we were, and I don't want to necessarily say what the numbers should be, but if we were to create an example to say somebody, and I recently read that that's an age that is very strong when it comes to, starting to receive Social Security and so forth. If we were to say, okay, somebody starts at 62 and goes forward, and you mentioned currently 72, 3 and 4 is basically when the withdrawal starts. That 10-year window, if we want to look at that, can you describe a little bit how that would actually look like for somebody, let's say, who says, okay, I need $5,000 a month or something like that?
So the book also refers to a website created, retirementtaxsaver.com, that's got a free calculator at it, where you can put in your own numbers. What do you have in your IRAs or other accounts, or if you have other income like real estate, it's a kind of a miscellaneous category, but certainly for your real estate income, that would fit well. And your age, when you're going to start Social Security, what it is, all those numbers. And then it'll show you kind of with the conventional wisdom of waiting to withdraw, what are you going to owe cumulatively in taxes between, let's say, age 62 in your example and age 80, and then also taxes all the way out to 90 if you're lucky enough to live that long. So that's kind of your base number. Conventional wisdom, you might owe, let's say, $200,000 over the course of 20 or 30 years. Now let's try some withdrawals. What if I took out, you can plug this into the calculator, let's say $20,000 a year before required minimum distributions are mandated, and how much does that save in taxes? And you can try 20,000, 30,000, 10,000, try some different numbers, and it'll show you the tax savings. And for a lot of people, it's going to add up to at least tens of thousands of dollars, and in many instances, even hundreds of thousands of dollars if you're going to make it to 90 and you've got a fair amount of resources set aside for retirement.
So that would be like the cumulative amount, is that correct?
Exactly. So that's over 20 or 30 years. So I'm putting it in terms of one big lump, but yes, that's spread out over many years. That's how you can get to that big lump.
Okay. Now, if we were to look at you taking out substantially more than you need, which is kind of, if I understand right, what you're suggesting, do you also have any recommendations what to do with it?
Well, there's two ways you could look at it. Either one, use that money from the IRA and 401k that you take out earlier and use that for your expenses instead of, and then leave your other accounts alone. So that's one way to do it. But I do mention in the book, of course, there is the option of a Roth conversion, which is if you do have enough other sources of income to meet your day-to-day expenses in the 60s and up to early 70s, well, that's still a way to take advantage of the low tax brackets that you might be in, as opposed to when you hit required minimum distribution age. Let's take out some of that income earlier and put it into a Roth IRA where it can now continue to grow tax-free and then be withdrawn tax-free. So you're still going to save taxes over the long run by you pay a little bit upfront. That's the penalty of doing this, is if you take an earlier withdrawal, that's considered taxable income. So you might owe some taxes in those years before required minimum distributions start. But the point is, you pay a little bit of taxes now, you'll save more taxes later.
Absolutely. And I think there's also, since especially I believe the more mature we get, the more we want to look at diversification of the places where the money goes. So I think there is a great opportunity to create a mix of investment types, some of which give you depreciation, some of it, which give you kind of like upfront losses, so to speak, for your investment, and others, like you just mentioned, are basically the same asset class, but in a different vehicle. So I think it is, I'm not a CPA, I'm not a lawyer or anything like that, but knowing quite a bit about what different areas of asset accumulation exist, I believe it is definitely possible to arrange it in a way that you wouldn't have to pay taxes on the money that you have basically taken out if you basically distribute it correctly. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think there's some ways to do that. There are different investment vehicles. The point of my book is I'm not necessarily trying to convince you to have a lot of different types of investments. So I'm basically saying you invest where you're comfortable investing, but you can still use this don't wait to withdraw strategy and keep your existing philosophy of investing pretty much intact. And it's not really a new investment tool that costs any money. It's just a matter of how you withdraw from your accounts when. There's a lot of truth. For example, a Roth conversion to a Roth IRA, that's money that you could leave in there. You might want to leave in there a very long time because it can build up tax-free forever. So maybe the type of investment that you think might pay off in 20 years or so and would have been otherwise been heavily taxed in 20 years, well, that might be a great thing for a Roth IRA where you can just kind of leave it alone and not have to worry about the taxes later because it's going to be tax-free.
Yeah, and I would come right along with that. I'm always preaching to do investments in positive cash flowing real estate that you can either hand over to your heirs, or you can put it in an estate plan, or you can 1031 exchange it without having to pay taxes for it, but then have the income source, and if you're lucky, also some appreciation coming out of it. And at least typically in the first 5 to 10 years, there's almost no taxable income, even though you're getting positive cash flow the whole time. And it can be quite substantial, especially since, the numbers can be at a point where you don't really have to get financing. You can just straight out buy something and make $1,000 a month for each house that you buy, right? And
right, and I know you're kind of into that diversification. Maybe you'd have several real estate properties that create their own flow, and that certainly gives you a little more flexibility, just a little ease of administration. If you are going to move money from one bucket to another bucket, if you've got several properties, you can just move individual ones, leave other ones behind.
Yeah, absolutely. Besides the fact that with the real estate investing that we recommend, we are only looking at properties regardless of what the age of the investor is. So whether you are already in that early 60s or much sooner, where you basically only invest in a property that is performing, which for me means it has to make money from day one, right? Like let's say you buy $150,000 or $200,000 property that has to pay you $1,500, $1,800, $2,000 a month in rent. Well, then you definitely have the vast majority, something like 80% of that rent is coming into your pocket. But because of all the things that real estate is doing from a government perspective about depreciation, all the different kinds of write-offs and stuff like that, you basically pay very little to no tax. And you have basically that income. You could even go as far theoretically to say, okay, I'm pulling the money out and basically creating my retirement income, not by literally spending the money of the 401k, but spending the rent. That would just be one way to go. Now, one other thing I have to say, we just recently, at the end of 2023, reached the 34 trillion national debt level. I know that nobody that is a little bit into money and investing and stuff ever assumes that anybody would ever even try to pay that back. But on the other hand, I mean, there's obviously a cost to it. So what's your thinking when we're saying, okay, I'm assuming at least that your calculator, I looked briefly at it, is basically taking currently available information for taxation, right? But if we're looking a little bit forward in light of this enormously and vastly and rapidly growing debt on all levels, what do you think is going to happen to taxes in general?
Well, we've got one thing, I won't call it a sure thing, but it's built into the system right now that in 2026, income tax rates go up.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the 2017 tax cuts expire that year. And you layer that on top of the fact that the rates we're paying right now, historically, excuse me, over the last 50, 60 years or more, lowest income rate tax rates there's ever been, really. Yeah. So is it more likely to go down than up? I'm not a betting man, but if I was going to place a bet, I'd say it was going to go up, especially when you had, the debt has gone up and now interest rates have gone up, which is great if you have a money market account, but bad if you're a government incurring, $1 trillion or more of debt every year. Now you got to pay 5% or 4% on that debt instead of 1%. Even, that's going to add to the deficit itself too. So at some point you might say we might have to raise some taxes here one way or the other. I know for Congress, that's something a lot of them never want to do. And that's why we're in this mess in the first place. But I can't imagine them going any lower. And you're right, the calculator doesn't assume anything about future tax rates, just that they stay the same. But if you think that they're going to go up, that's just all the more reason to take more money out of your 401k or IRA before required minimum distributions are in effect, just to take advantage of today's kind of rock bottom income tax rates.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of money market accounts because the interest is also taxed like income, right? So that could have a pretty high interest, pretty high tax rate as well. Really pretty convinced that taxes will have to go up. If that's true, then that would be even more of an argument to say, well, let's not wait for that. So rather, get into it as soon as possible, as soon as it makes sense.
Right.
Now, I know in general, 59.5 is kind of like the free of fines age, so to speak. Are there any other years or age or any other things that you can share that our audience should be aware of?
That's a really good point, that you can start taking money out of those tax deferred accounts at 59.5 years old without having to pay a penalty. It's a 10% penalty. It's not huge, but it's money you'd rather keep in your pocket, all things
It's on
being
the
equal.
amount.
Yeah, every little bit helps, right?
Yeah.
And before that, there are certain situations you can start using the money before 59.5, education expenses, some hardship situations and things like that. So if you really want to pursue that, there are certainly some options there. It seems like that list of exceptions grows and grows more every year. But generally, yeah, that the sweet spot here, this honeymoon phase, if you're able to retire as soon as 59.5, yeah, you don't have to take money out of the tax deferred accounts, but you can without incurring a penalty and take advantage of your lower tax brackets all the way up till you get to your RMD age, which I say at that range because it depends on your birth year. But it's going to be somewhere between about 72 and 74 years old for just about everybody.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. And the other thing I wanted to ask you, because you wrote the book about it, so maybe you can help with that. Is, I mean, we touched briefly on the self-directed option that people have, right? It doesn't have to be like managed by your employer, or it doesn't have to be managed by some like of these huge brokerages. One thing that I've heard, and I was too old to actually take advantage, but I heard there is an option where you can say, okay, I can basically borrow against what's in it. And that then basically becomes opportunity to make investments. And, I can basically pay back with interest into my own account, which ultimately would mean you would increase the amount of money in it while you have an investment that potentially basically generates income for you. Have you heard something like that? And is that a way to work things out?
I don't think I have that in my own 401k, so I don't have a lot of personal knowledge of that. I know for life insurance, that can be an option, though, if you've got some cash value in a whole life policy to do that sort of thing. I'd want to double check what the interest rate is, though, that you have to pay on it, just to make sure, it's going to be something that's not going to be too much of a price that you have to pay to warrant whatever benefits you get from
Well,
withdrawing.
it depends on how you look at it, right? Like if you say, okay, I'm basically borrowing against my own 401k assets, stocks or whatever might be in it. And then the money that I'm getting, I'm paying back into my 401k with 10% interest. That would actually increase for that amount of money, the amount that's in it by that amount of interest, right? So if you pay back in, that's actually one of the options that are, I know for sure, available in the solo K. I just don't know if it's available in a 401k. In the solo K, you can basically say, I have $100,000 worth of stock. I borrow against it. And I'm basically, as the owner of that account, am promising myself, quote unquote, to pay myself back with 10% interest, which is sometimes interesting because if you somehow late to the party or you're not consistently employed, the amount of money that's in the tax deferred account is limited, right? You can't put unlimited amounts of money in, but when you borrow against it and pay yourself interest back, you can kind of artificially increase the amount that goes.
I see. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. If you're trying to get some more money in that account, that does seem like a way to kind of turbocharge it a little bit.
Yeah, I know a lot of people that were really getting good advice on that, took advantage of it when there was this, you could take 200,000 out free during the pandemic, no penalty and stuff, make an investment and call it a loan and then pay it back with interest. And you ultimately ended up with 250,000 back into your account 5 years later. So.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Now, in the overall context, are there any certain levels where you would say, when is it worth it? Like, I mean, I would ask myself the question, sometimes you hear these kind of articles in the bigger newspapers, most people have no more than $50,000 accumulated for retirement. I'm assuming there should be a certain volume to talk about. I don't know if you have that in your book, or when would you say is all this kind of early deductions and thinking about the taxes and the rates and so forth. Is there like a number where you would say, well, it should be at least, I don't know, 200,000, 500,000 or any number that where it starts making a lot of difference?
Well, in the From Savvy Saver to Smart Spender book, I've got a number of hypotheticals. And one that might be surprising to people was a couple that had about $300,000 or $400,000 in their tax deferred accounts as they're getting to retirement age, which is not that big, frankly. I mean, a lot of people don't have even that much, but that's certainly a number that a lot of people have achieved. That's not far from the average of people that do have those types of accounts. So pretty average number. They can actually benefit from this a lot. The taxes they owe may not be as much as somebody who has a million or two, but the tax savings from using the strategy in my book actually are more dramatic for folks in that niche. And the reason why is Social Security. Social Security, it's kind of a complex way that that's taxed in retirement. It's either taxed not at all, or it's taxed 50 cents on the dollar, or it's taxed 85 cents on the dollar, depending on how much other income you have. And for folks in that $300,000 or $400,000 range, what they'll find is if they wait to withdraw from their 401k or IRA until they get to required minimum distributions, they'll have a big enough distribution that they'll start making their Social Security taxable as well as the distribution. But if you start before you get to the RMD age, you spread things out and you take out small enough withdrawals before RMD age that you don't trigger Social Security taxation. And you can also, after you get to RMD age, you've now depleted your account value enough that your RMD is low enough, you'll continue to not be taxed on Social Security, or at least be taxed a lot less. So a lot of different bells and whistles and knobs that can be adjusted here. That's why you just, the calculator takes into account the Social Security and this 0, 50, 85% issue. But I think the bottom line is you just got to run the numbers to know for sure. Don't assume just because you don't have a big account that you couldn't benefit.
Absolutely. And I was just about to say, you did provide a really, really great service for anybody who is either planning and maybe not even that close to retirement age yet, or is approaching it, maybe even for people that have recently gotten into the retirement age, like this 62 to 75 bracket, that you have that calculator on your website. And I'm sure it's also explained in the book, for people to really run the numbers, even if it doesn't include any kind of future tax increases or stuff like that. So I think all of us here in the audience, myself included, we should be grateful that somebody had a kid and could figure out
exactly the tuition. I won't tell you how much the tuition costs, but I will tell you this: I got a little bit of a value back anyway.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sort of.
Cool. Well, I mean, it's a long-term appreciation, I'm sure. So. Okay, cool. Well, so with that being said, there are two questions that I ask everybody at the end of the show, and the first one of those is, if you could meet anybody, who would it be and why?
I would say probably Elon Musk.
Okay.
I've worked with many inventors that, in the patent, I do patent litigation.
Right.
And always, was the best part of the job, is getting to know these folks that were these visionaries, CEOs, or they're inventors, and just always learned a lot from them. And just really, I'm in awe of those people that have that vision and see things that nobody else sees, where they can create something. And boy, Elon Musk was not a client, but just knowing the vision he's had and the things he's created that just didn't exist before, he's really at the pinnacle of that sort of a skill set. And I've always been inspired by that sort of thing, and that would just make my decade if I could meet him.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of thinking. I mean, he's early 50s, so there's probably a few more things that we can't even imagine that he might come up with, even though I find it interesting that he doesn't seem to be a big fan of patents, right? Like most of the stuff that they have come up with, either not patented or they only get the patent so that it's actually registered, but not really to protect it. For most of the Tesla stuff, I know that he said anybody can use it as long as they're not misuse it.
Right.
It's actually pretty cool.
Well, yeah, and again, that's part of his vision, because in a lot of established industries, that patent battle between well-established competitors, that can really give you an edge. He really kind of reevaluated his situation, didn't say beholden to traditional or conventional wisdom, but he's developing a whole new technology, a whole new area. And that's maybe got all sorts of different dynamics there in terms of how the competition would interact. You just want to get that technology out there and get people switching from the old to the new. And that's more important than keeping your little small niche protected, I think. And I think, again, there's a perfect example of how he recognizes that in many cases it's smart to buck conventional wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. He actually did say once, I remember, that their work and their technology is so far ahead that any competitor needs binoculars to see. You know,
Yeah,
so,
well,
yeah, so
that's kind of trash talking, but he backs it up, doesn't he?
I wouldn't be able to really point to a credible competitor in almost all the technologies. I mean, nobody's landing rockets. I mean, I'm originally European, and if I'm looking at the European Space Agency, launched 4 rockets in 2023, and SpaceX launches 4 rockets per month at least.
Relative shoestring budget too, right?
Yeah. Okay, so then the other thing, second and last question is, if you had a time machine, where would you go and why?
Well, kind of unrelated note to what we were just talking about, I'd probably go back to the 1960s with NASA, Mission Controller, Cape Canaveral, I guess it was called before it was Cape Kennedy.
Yeah.
Just that the work on getting a man to the moon and back safely, when those calculators, right, or the electronics that they had available was just a fraction of what you can get on a calculator on your desk, let alone your cell phone, your smartphone, and how they were able to, with the technology, almost caveman level technology available, make sure all those numbers fit just right with each other. I just in awe of. And as a kid, I grew up watching that stuff on TV, and I built Saturn V model rockets. You can maybe see a picture or two of some outer space scenes in the background here. Always been interested in space, and so I put all that together. Again, these are amazing people that had great vision and made something happen that this couldn't have happened before.
Yeah, totally. And study this historically, and you mentioned Elon. He is basically replicating what Kennedy triggered, right? By saying, okay, we basically need to rapidly iterate to get to a solution that works. Not necessarily saying we need to get to the best solution. Now, what they're trying now with SLS at NASA is completely crazy, and basically they can't afford to fail, and that costs them 10 billion a rocket or something like that. But fundamentally okay, we need to have a vision, and then we need to iterate to realize the vision. That's basically what SpaceX is doing now, which these guys did in the 60s and early 70s. All right, cool. Well, Daniel, it was a great pleasure having you. I think you, like I said, really did do a great service by providing the book and providing the calculator, because, what is it? 10,000 people a day are actually reaching retirement right now. And a lot of them are probably wondering how the numbers actually work and how to best utilize what they basically accumulated over all these years.
Right. And this year are particularly good years for this strategy, right before the tax rates go up.
Yeah, absolutely. So one more time, how can people get a hold of you?
The book is From Savvy Saver to Smart Spender on Amazon. Easy to find there. And the website is retirementtaxsaver.com.
Wonderful. Retirementtaxsaver.com, and Daniel McDonald, guys, that's where you need to go if it applies to you. So thank you, and talk to you soon.
Thanks so much for having me.